Top 10 Shocking Secrets of Death Row. Did you know that in some parts of the world, death row prisoners spend decades in tiny, windowless cells with no human contact? What if we told you that in many countries, their final hours are shockingly different, quick, ruthless, and terrifying? Today, we will talk about the top 10 most extreme death rows around the world, where the conditions and stories will leave you speechless. Before we start, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned because this is going to be a shocking ride. Number 10. Solitary confinement in the U.S. Death row isolation. On number 10, we have one of the most infamous practices on death row in the United States, solitary confinement. Their prisoners are locked up in a tiny, windowless cell for 23 hours a day with no one to talk to, no sunlight, and nothing to break the silence. Solitary confinement is a common practice in many U.S. prisons, especially for those awaiting execution. The idea is that keeping prisoners isolated prevents violence and ensures security. But the psychological effects are brutal. Inmates are left alone with their thoughts, often for years or even decades, with little to no human contact. Many inmates suffer from severe depression, anxiety, and even hallucinations. One example of how solitary confinement can take a toll on a person is the case of Anthony Graves. He spent 18 years on death row in Texas, 12 of those years in solitary confinement, for a crime he didn't commit. Graves was placed in a tiny cell and only allowed out for 1 hour each day. For that hour, he could walk around a small space outside, but still, with no contact with others. In an interview, he described how it felt. You're left alone with nothing but your thoughts, and those thoughts become your worst enemy. Graves talked about how he would hear other prisoners scream sometimes for hours as they struggled to cope with the isolation. What's worse, many prisoners like Graves spend years in solitary confinement without knowing when or if their execution will happen. Some had their execution dates set and then postponed multiple times. Despite being widely criticized by human rights groups, solitary confinement remains a standard practice on U.S. death row. Number 9. The final hours in Japan. Now let's talk about one of the most secretive and psychologically intense death row systems in the world, Japan's, where prisoners wake up every single day, not knowing if it's going to be their last. They're only told on the very day of their execution, sometimes just a few hours before it happens. Executions in Japan are carried out by hanging, and the government keeps everything about the process under wraps. Inmates sit in their cells for years, never knowing when the knock on the door will come. One case that stands out is that of Uwa Hakamada. Hakamada spent over 45 years on death row, making him the longest-serving death row inmate in the world. He was convicted in 1968 for the murder of a family in Japan, but his trial was later found to be deeply flawed, with claims of forced confessions and fabricated evidence. For decades, he sat in his cell, knowing that each day could be his last. Hakamada's mental health deteriorated over time, a clear reflection of the psychological toll of Japan's death row. By the time he was released in 2014, after new DNA evidence came to light proving his innocence, he was a shadow of his former self. He had developed severe mental illness, likely as a result of years of solitary confinement and the stress of never knowing when his execution might come. The lack of transparency and the way the system operates are reasons why many call Japan's death row one of the most brutal and psychologically damaging death rows in the world. Number 8. Execution chambers in China. Let's turn our attention to China, the country with the highest number of executions in the world. Unlike many other places where death row inmates wait for years, sometimes decades, China's process is startlingly swift. Once someone is sentenced to death, the execution can happen in a matter of weeks, sometimes even just days. Executions in China are typically carried out by lethal injection or firing squad. While the method may seem clinical and efficient, it's the volume and the rapidity of these executions that shocks many. One infamous case that brought international attention was that of Wu Ying, a businesswoman sentenced to death in 2009 for financial fraud. The case sparked outrage because of the lack of transparency and the harshness of the sentence compared to similar cases. Another tragic example is the case of Ni Shubin, a young man who was executed in 1995 for the rape and murder of a woman. He maintained his innocence throughout his trial, but his execution was carried out swiftly after he was sentenced. It wasn't until 2 decades later that evidence emerged proving that Ni had been wrongfully convicted. Number 7. The dead man walking in Thailand. Now, let's talk about Thailand's death row, a place known for its uniquely drawn-out process that leaves inmates in a state of prolonged uncertainty. What sets Thailand apart isn't just the fact that prisoners can spend decades waiting for their execution, but the haunting final steps they must take when the moment arrives. When execution is scheduled, prisoners are taken one by one to the execution chamber where a lethal injection is used. This process is slow and methodical. heightening the sense of dread for everyone involved. A real-life case that illustrates the brutal reality of Thailand's death row is that of Theerawat Phonaimat. In 2018, he was executed by lethal injection for a murder he had committed in 2012. The executions themselves are private, but the process leading up to them isn't hidden from the rest of the inmates. This combination of long waits and a slow, methodical approach to execution has made Thailand's death row infamous around the world. Number 6. Uganda's black hole cells. Uganda's death row is known for its terrible conditions, with prisoners kept in what are often called black hole cells. These cells are tiny, dark, and filthy, making every day a fight for survival. Many prisoners suffer from extreme malnutrition, diseases, and neglect, and some die before they even make it to their execution. The prisoners are packed into small spaces, usually lying on the floor without beds or blankets, left to survive in complete darkness. One well-known example is Susan Kigula, a woman who spent years on Uganda's death row before her sentence was reduced. Her story shows just how awful the conditions are and the daily struggles these prisoners face. Even though Susan endured the horror of waiting in those black hole cells, she became an advocate for change, fighting for the end of the death penalty in Uganda. Are you finding this journey through the world's most brutal death rows as chilling as we are? It's only going to get more intense from here. Don't miss out on our future videos. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment. And stay tuned because our top 3 death rows will shock you. You won't believe what's coming next. Number 5. Nigeria's overcrowded death row. Nigeria's death row is notorious for its overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The cells are cramped and inmates are forced to live in conditions far below basic human standards. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care makes survival a daily challenge. Many prisoners don't make it to their execution day. Diseases, malnutrition, and neglect claim their lives first. The uncertainty is one of the worst parts. Prisoners never know when or if their execution will take place. For some, the prolonged waiting becomes a psychological form of torture. This waiting game can stretch on for years, creating a living nightmare where time feels like it's standing still. Number 4. Death row phenomenon in the United States. We've already touched on solitary confinement in the US, but another layer to the country's extreme death row experience is what's known as the death row phenomenon. This term refers to the unique form of psychological torture that comes from waiting for decades, often in isolation, for an execution that might never come. The U.S. justice system allows for constant appeals, stays of execution, and repeated delays, which can drag on for years. For prisoners, this means living in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when their final day will be. The constant stress of having an execution date set, only for it to be postponed multiple times, leaves many inmates mentally broken long before they're physically executed. Number 3. The firing squads of North Korea. In North Korea, death row is as much about control and fear as it is about punishment. Prisoners are often subjected to public executions by firing squad, a brutal method that's designed to send a message. These executions are sometimes carried out in front of family members and local citizens, forcing the community to witness the state's harsh approach to punishment. But it's not just the executions themselves that are terrifying. It's the conditions leading up to them. Prisoners on death row in North Korea are often tortured, starved, and forced into labor camps before their execution day arrives. One notable case is that of Jang Song-thak, the uncle of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Jang, once a powerful figure in the regime, was executed by firing squad in 2013 after being accused of treason. His execution was part of a larger purge within the government, showing that even those with power are immune to North Korea's extreme form of punishment. The swiftness and brutality of his execution made headlines around the world, highlighting the country's unforgiving death row practices. Number 2. Public executions in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries where public executions are still carried out regularly. These executions, often by beheading, take place in broad daylight in public squares. The method of execution, beheading, is swift but brutal, and the fact that it's done in public adds an extra layer of fear and humiliation. Crowds gather to witness the executions, which are meant to serve as a warning to others. One high-profile case was that of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, a prominent Shia cleric who was executed in 2016 for his role in anti-government protests. His execution sparked international outrage and highlighted the political and sectarian tensions within Saudi Arabia. Number 1. The Gallows of Iran. Iran has one of the highest execution rates in the world, and its method of choice, public hangings, is as brutal as it gets. Death row prisoners in Iran are often executed with little warning in front of crowds, making the process both swift and terrifying. One case that shocked the world was the execution of Rayhan Jabari in 2014. Jabari, who was convicted of killing a man she claimed had tried to assault her, was hanged in a public square after spending 7 years on death row. Her case drew widespread international attention, with many calling for her release due to the questionable circumstances of her conviction. Lauren's death row is known for its swift and brutal nature, making it one of the most feared in the world. What do you think about the way different countries handle death row? Should the system be more humane, or is it just the price these prisoners pay for their crimes? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. We've got plenty more shocking and thought-provoking content coming your way, so hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.